Morning.
Good morning.
Shlomo.
Shlomo.
It's great to be back with you for one more talk today. Also, we're going to continue with where we left off yesterday afternoon, speaking about holy people and their traditions. We have the person, the life, the real person, and then you have the devotion that develops around that person, and both are very important and rich. I'm going to think today in particular about women and heroines. I could have just said saints, but I was trying to think of a different word. But holy people, holy women from the Syriac tradition. And I'm going to also talk about at least one woman who was not from the Syriac tradition, but who is venerated by the Syriac tradition. So we'll have a bit of a mix. And a mix of types. So holiness and discipleship can take different forms. And how that looks, how that maps out onto the life of a woman is going to be different than a man. And certainly if that's true today, it was even more so true in the early church. So we can think about that as you go. I'm going to talk briefly about one of my favorite women in the Syriac church, Saint Febronia of Nisibis. Her life is translated in a wonderful book that I can commend to you, to Holy Women of the Syrian Orient, translated by Sebastian Brock and Susan Ashbrook Harvey. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about Febronia over the years because of her compelling story. And I'm going to talk about her. And it's interesting to sort of realize that actually this picture, so she's shown up here in the top right, a picture of Febronia, but this is from Bari, Italy. She's actually venerated in Italy as well, which is why I think she's a very interesting saint. So I'm going to also talk a little bit about how her tradition came into the Western church. We often think about the sort of the influx of, say, Roman or Latin-speaking saints coming into the Eastern churches, but it goes the other direction too. And also I should say too, to think about what sanctity is in the lives of women, you don't have to just look at the lives of female saints, because in fact, if you look at the lives of male saints as well, there are often women playing important roles, especially mothers and sisters. There's a very interesting tradition about mothers of saints. So the mothers of children who become great people, and the delicate special ways that they know how to raise their children, as well as sisters. So you can see this too in many Syriac lives. And someday I'd like to do a project just on that, siblings and sanctity, because there's a whole kind of study I think that could be done about that. And to reiterate what I mentioned yesterday, it's important to, from a theological point of view, remember, saints' lives can be studied from a variety of perspectives. And that's in the academic realm. Some people study them just as cultural documents or as something kind of interesting, or just purely for some people they are just sort of purely legendary. And then, but from the theological point of view, there's always the important reality of our belief in the incarnation. Again, because God became a person, people are called to become like God. And it's wonderful because there's a variety of ways that a person can become like God. And that's what the lives of the saints exemplify. There will always be some kind of sacrifice that's required of a saint. You can't have a person move from a sort of a normal existence to holiness without something being required. Something will have to be given up or let go in the process of becoming someone new. And so there's a huge, beautiful trend in the stories of the saints of conversions, of changing of heart, and of how God will always do something unexpected. In other words, God will choose unlikely candidates to do wonderful things with them. And so we're all called to become something special, and to make and to be prepared also to face the shadow of the cross, which is cast over everyone's life in the hope of resurrection. So you see this beautiful pattern in the lives of the saints. And in the stories of the martyrs, we'll talk about this briefly too, they sometimes do get extremely violent. And that can be a bit shocking to our sensibilities. But we have to also remember that that's part of the memory. We were talking at breakfast about a saint, with you in your parish of how the children gravitate to a saint with an axe through the middle of his head. You know, the sort of very violent symbols. But that is worth considering. Why is that? Well, it's shocking, yes, but it's also very vivid. And as humans, we remember vivid things. We remember vivid things. So if we saw something happen, an event, every one of us would have a slightly different understanding of what we saw. If I said, something happened, or even let's just say our talk, pretend you weren't taking notes. If you were just listening, you would all remember what I said just a little bit differently. And it would all be sort of true, but it would be a different perspective. And the saints' lives are kind of like that. So you need something bold. If I had worn a really silly hat today, you probably would just all remember that. I didn't do that, but I'm just sort of giving an example. That's how sort of the saints' lives work. So you have these sort of bold images that the imagination can capture and remember, like axes through your heads. Okay. So New Cybele is today in Nisibis. In the ancient world, it was called Nisibis, as some of you might know. New Cybele is its modern name. It's a city that in the ancient world lay on the boundaries between the Roman and the Persian Empire. It's in today what is now modern southeast Turkey, and it was a center for Syriac speaking Christianity. You can still go there today. Had the opportunity in 2006 to go there with a group. It was really interesting. And you can see, actually, if you go to Nisibis today, you can see the church that belonged to the Christian community. You can visit the place where Jacob of Nisibis, a very famous bishop, is buried. And Ephraim the Syrian actually spent a large portion of his life in Nisibis before he goes to Edessa, the end of his life. And it was also known in later periods for being a very important intellectual center. There was a school of Nisibis there, great schools. So it's a very important center. And it's out of this context that you get devotion to this woman here, Saint Febronia of Nisibis. And I'll tell you a little bit about her story. I'm not going to sort of get into this question of whether or not she really was a real person. That's a very interesting historical question. But what I'm going to talk about is the stories that people told about her. I do believe that there probably was a woman named Febronia. But there's enough things about her legend which don't quite make sense to see that whoever the person was and the saint was, there was a little bit of mixing going on. That's okay. There's still a lot to tell us. And she becomes a really important saint for the Syriac Christians. Even today, for instance, in the city of Mardin, in Tur Abdin, there was a mayor, a young woman named Febronia, who was a Christian woman named Febronia, who was the mayor of the city. So even today, it has a sort of very important place in Syriac religious tradition. So her life was actually set into a particular period of time, the Diocletian period. So there was a lot of martyrs in early Christianity under the Emperor Diocletian, right before Constantine will legalize Christianity in 313 with the Edict of Milan. So right in the period right before that time, there's a lot of stories told about martyrs, about men and women who give their life for Jesus, who don't want to sacrifice their Christian identity to become a pagan or to do anything which could be considered renouncing Christianity, and so choose death instead. There's a lot of martyrs from that time. And so the story, so Febronia's life dates to this period, but it's set again in Nisibis, in the beginning of the 4th century. What's interesting about her hagiography is that it's purported to have been written by a woman. Very unusual. We don't have, in fact, one thing that's important to think about is most of what we know about women in the early church comes through what men said about them. We don't have their own words. In other words, that's important to think about. That is to say, we don't have a lot of documents that were composed by women, so we have only the construction of what a woman and of what of sanctity is through the eyes of men. So that's an important kind of piece to consider. But this text was written by a woman who claims to have been a fellow sister with Febronia. So Febronia is a woman who is raised in a monastery. So you have this tradition that she lives in a convent in the city of Nisibis. And she goes there as a little girl, and the nuns raise her, and she has a very special relationship with the Mother Superior, who educates Febronia. So Febronia is already portrayed in the story as a great scholar. That's an important piece. She's a teacher, so she teaches the other sisters. She's a philosopher. She's a very educated, intellectual person. And the story goes to a great deal also to describe that her intellectual beauty and the impression of her is matched by beautiful physical attraction. So she was also very beautiful on the so inside and out. And she was so beautiful that the Mother Superior was afraid of ever letting any man come into the monastery. They didn't ever want anyone to lay eyes on how beautiful Febronia is. So the story elevates her. She practices the monastic disciplines of fasting and prayer together with the sisters. And what's so pretty is not the right word. What's so interesting about this text is how you see how the sisters in the story act together as a family, which teaches something that was going on in the early church, that when men and women would join monasteries, in fact, that would become their new family. They would take on this new identity as being a part of a new family, leave their earthly family and join this monastic family. You see this very much. So she's also held up in the story too, not just as a very intelligent person, but a very courageous person, and willing to go to great lengths to show her faith and devotion to Jesus. To give a quick summary, because I don't want to go into, I don't have time to rehearse the entire narrative of Febronia, but what happens is, when the persecution breaks out against Christians, as it's told in the story, some emissaries of the emperor arrive in Nisibis, and they want to kill all the Christians, and they want to attack the monastery. It's a very violent scene. And the sisters are saying, we need to get out of here, we need to flee. And Febronia is the one that says, no, we need to stay, we need to be brave, we need to face this. And so she's very courageous. She is much more courageous than her fellow sisters, even in the story. And so she stays, she's captured. And because she is so beautiful, they say, we're not gonna kill you, all you have to do is convert to paganism, and then you can marry the emperor's son. So it's this idea of, we want you just to join our community, renounce Christianity. Febronia refuses. And so what follows in the second part of the story is a very brutal, graphic description of how she's tortured and martyred. It's very painful to read that part of the text, because it is, as I said, it's shocking in how gory the story, the gory details that go into how she is killed. And it is, as in a lot of stories about the martyrs, it is clear throughout the story that Christ is with her at every step of the way. One of the theological themes that you see, because martyrs imitate Jesus through how he died, they become the ideal saint. Because they share in that passion, they're able to endure such pain because of their love of God. The love of Christ gives them this almost special power to withstand terrible torture. That comes up in the martyr text very often. There's also a very upsetting and shocking description of how she is sexually tortured in the text. So there's a lot that they do everything to dehumanize this woman in every step of the way. And she never loses her cool. And that is, like, you see this in a lot of martyr texts too, that what's expected in the ancient world is that a woman will get emotional, that a woman will not have strength, that a woman will back down. And so the female martyrs always show that, as a matter of fact, they are anything but that. Right? They take those expectations, they invert them, and they become the great heroes in the end. And so you have this contrast that's built up between the brutality of the men torturing her and her humanity, her courage, and all coming from the love of God. And so after she is martyred, then there's a great scene in the text of her, what to do with her body. And this is a very interesting thing. Many of us know that the devotion to relics is a big thing in Christianity and in Catholicism. And you have this scene of the local bishop and the sisters fighting over her body. They both want pieces, literally, of her body. And it's one of the funny things about saints' lives is that you'll have the description of the saint herself, and then you have the description of the people. And it's in the description of the people where you see the humanity. It's just kind of silly. You know, here's this wonderful woman, and what do you have immediately after? You have people acting like little kids, saying, I want her, part of her, I want a part of her. You know, the contrast is very interesting, right? And in one scene, the sisters agree to give the bishop a tooth, that he can have one of her teeth, and that's all. And so, if I recall, I've got to.
The sisters won.
The sisters win. And there was a professor in St. Louis who excavated to near Syria and found excavations of a monastic complex that he thinks was connected to Febronia in some way. And they found there, these are prayers that people tied to her, to like a tree in remembrance of Febronia. Have you seen this kind of practice before?
Mm-hmm. In Mexico.
In Mexico, yeah. I'm always kind of curious if this has echoes and things that you are more familiar with. And they also found a reliquary of her tooth, which was a very interesting archaeological find.
Thanks to the bishops.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's kind of fun. It's funny and a bit odd how reliquaries, so containers for saints' bones, tend to take the form of the body object that they're holding. And so if you have a bone of a martyr's arm, it'll look like an arm very often, not always. And so here, this actually looks like a tooth, if you could see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a cross imprinted, it's a bit too blown up. But if you could see it, you could see it looks more like a tooth. And so it's a very beautiful, powerful, romantic story. I would highly recommend that you read it sometime, and I'd love to get your opinion on it. It's very moving, it's very interesting. And it's the kind of text that each time you read it, you'll find something different and find something new. It has that. And so, her devotion to Febronia spread to Sicily. And several years ago, I had the opportunity to go to southern Italy and look into this because I thought that this was just really interesting. How is it that a tradition about a Syrian woman made it from from Nisibis, from the Syriac-speaking world into the Latin-speaking world. And still today, she's a very popular saint. So there are 3 cities, 2 in Sicily and 1 in southern Italy, which venerate Febronia, Santa Febronia. This is in Pelagonia. So I went on a little tour. It was a nice excuse to go to Sicily. I thought, I'm going to go do some research. Yeah. Guilty as charged. But no, but it was really interesting, and they were very gracious. You can see this is a parade, and they're carrying her image around.
When is her feast day?
June 22nd, the beginning of, in the Roman calendar. I don't know what it is in the Syrian Orthodox calendar. It might be the same, but Roman Catholic is, June 22nd, I think. Right around the 20 something.
I'll check.
Yeah. As well as Patti, another city. And this is an image of her holding her palm. So martyrs, as many of you will know, will often be depicted holding a palm. A palm was believed to be capable of regeneration. That the palm, even if you cut it down, it could come back to life, like a martyr. Or the idea that a martyr is truly born through death. You become truly who you are through dying. And so as I said, her life was translated first into Greek and then into Latin. So her story exists in 3 ancient languages of the early church. She also has a chapel in Constantinople, ancient Constantinople, and she appears in the lives of in the Greek lives. I'm gonna misspeak here, but she in stories about her appearances in the Greek traditions, she's seen healing women of gynecological problems. It's a very interesting thing. She has this special ministry to help women who are suffering from female problems. And so again, it's in the saints and in how they are remembered and how they are honored that you see the needs of people. What do people need? They need models. They need healing. They need help. And you'll see in these saints' lives that this comes up, and they need access. They need access to divine power and to divine blessings. And so the saints, of course, stand as our great intercessors, and we ask for their prayers. And each community will then develop different devotions to particular saints that become their symbol too. So the saint then becomes more than just a person. It becomes a symbol of a whole tradition. I'm speaking to the Maronites. You guys know this better than I do, right? So there's just a lot that we could say and consider about this. And as the stories get translated and retold, they'll change and shift slightly, depending on what symbols are meaningful to that person. Right. Okay. So then moving on to Saint Mary of Egypt, another wonderful saint of the early church. Anyone here familiar with her story? Many people. Great. Okay. I'm not going to spend tons of time going over her story then, but just to say, of course, she is also, even though she comes from Egypt, she is honored in the Syriac tradition. I actually translated her life, the Syriac version of the life of Saint Mary of Egypt. It was published last year, if you're interested. It's very similar to the Greek life, in fact, but still perhaps it's of interest to you. So as you can see in her icon, the saints, the pictures of the saints, the icons of the saints are supposed to indicate something about what it was that person did to make him or her holy. And she is not being depicted the way that most female saints are. So just to contrast how she looks, we can go back here to Febronia. Notice how Febronia is totally clothed, covered head, they're both holding crosses, but totally covered up. You can just sort of see a little bit of hair coming up from under her veil. Versus Saint Mary. right? Mary has an uncovered head, long grayed hair. Her body is emaciated. She's not looking at us. She's looking slightly to the side. You can tell me yourself what effect that has for you. Just something to consider, the effect of that versus a direct gaze when the icon looks straight at you. But she's got no female figure, does she? She looks like John the Baptist. If you know pictures of John the Baptist, she looks like John the Baptist. So the picture is showing that what the way by which God has glorified her was through her asceticism, through her imitation of great prophets, great ascetics like John. And if we go backwards into the story and see the story of her conversion, then it's even more profound to consider how she ends up. So St. Mary falls under a category of saints in the early church known as the penitent harlots. St. Mary was a prostitute in the city of Alexandria. And St. Mary is, in her own words, because she tells her own story, she talks about how her love and her lust were so unbridled that she was happy to do her activities even if she didn't get paid for it. So she's cast as an ultimate female figure of lust, completely abandoned to her own passions. And in the ancient world, think about it, right? If I say sinful woman, what's the immediate sin that you imagine for that person?
Prostitution. Right.
That's what it was. It was kind of unimaginative, as if that's the only way women could sin. But anyhow, for the ancient mind, that's what it was. And so the story will magnify what a horrible person she was, and then show what she becomes. So what the stories of the repentant, penitent harlots are dramatic. How God, the love of Christ, can turn the deepest, the worst sinner into the most glorified model of love. It's a turning of the heart. It's a possibility for conversion. If a woman who was such a prostitute is going to become a great saint, then none of us have any excuses. God is always ready to take a person back who is repentant. That's what the challenge of Mary is. So in the story of St. Mary, she goes on a pilgrimage, and she didn't intend to go on a pilgrimage. It was the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross, which I believe is in September.
14.
Yeah. and she jumps on a ship from Alexandria, going to Jerusalem, and she's excited to get on this ship because she's pretty sure there's going to be a lot of customers for her, for the boys. So she hops on this ship, and she goes along. And when she gets to Jerusalem, she sees a rush of people heading into a church. She's sort of interested and excited to see what all the activity is about, but she literally cannot cross the threshold. There is a force holding her back from crossing the threshold. And it's at that moment that she has this change of heart. She has a vision of the Mother of God appearing to her, and she entrusts herself to Mary, the Mother of God, as her sponsor. So this is tremendous, all of a sudden, awareness, the scales falling off her eyes of the life that she has been leading, and her tremendous need for God's mercy. So she turns into an ascetic. She leaves the city after her conversion, and she heads out into the desert. She doesn't want to be with anybody. She wants to be alone. She just takes a little bit of food with her and goes out into the desert, crosses the Jordan River. So again, the theology, and I love this icon because it shows her talking to Mary, the mother of God. This is Mary to Mary, right? Mary to Mary. So in the desert, she is sustained miraculously on very little food and through her trust in the protection of the Mother of God. But it's hard. So the text goes to great lengths to talk about how the temptations, the memories of her former life torture her. She thinks about what she used to have. She dreams of the wines of Alexandria. It's hard for her. It doesn't glorify that, what she's given up. And then she just weeps. So she spends years and years out in the desert. And the story, again, is reminding everyone that God never turns away anyone who repents. And it's interesting, too, to then talk about her friend in the story, Zosimus. Zosimus is a monk. He's also a great saint. We hear about Mary actually through him because Zosimus is the greatest monk of the times, basically. He's presented as this perfect icon of monastic sanctity. And all the monks go to him for direction, for mentorship. He's the great elder. And what do you do if lots of people tell you all the time how great you are? Do you believe them? It's a temptation, right?
Sure.
It's that temptation. So he is struggling with monastic pride. He literally says in the story, "Am I the greatest monk? Or is there someone holier than I am?" And this leads him out of his monastery in search of to answer this question. And in his wanderings, he comes into the desert. He sees a figure. He thinks it's a man or an animal, he can't tell, blackened, worn from the sun, and that's Mary. And he calls out to her. And here the Syriac version is really interesting because, as you know, there is a difference in verbs for female and male, right? Male and female. The verbal system is gender. And in the Syriac version, you can tell for sure that it is meant to be, he thinks it's a man. He addresses this person as a man, you know. And she knows immediately who he is. And so there's this, the miracle of the moment of this encounter is that she knows everything about him. She's already being gifted with some sort of divine insights. And so she says, "Father, step back. I'm a woman. Can I have your coat?" You know, and so he gives her his coat. And then they have this conversation. And she tells him her life-giving narrative. And that is hagiography. Hagiographies are these life-giving narratives. And so Mary tells Zosimus her story, and it transforms him. He's weeping because he starts to understand her profound love of God, what she has given up to become who she is. And he's also aware that her knowledge, she starts quoting the scriptures and reading the Psalms, her knowledge, even though she's never had any education, she's also been blessed with all of this knowledge of scripture and everything. God has already turned her into a saint. She's already a living saint. And her body then, you know, has been transformed into a totally unsexed person. He thinks she's a man. The issues that she had as a prostitute, all the sort of means by which she used to sin have been kind of completely removed from her. And what's so beautiful is that the two become friends. This is a really beautiful symbol too. Now she has a new relationship with men, right? She has this relationship with Zosimus, which is completely built, and it's a fraternal love of God between two men and women. So there's a lot of just beautiful things about this story. And he gives her the Eucharist. So her first meal then, after so much fasting, is to share in the Eucharist. He promises to come back in another year, which he does. But when he comes back, he finds that she has died. And in the story, we were talking about names. He forgets to get her name. He leaves this woman and forgets to ask what her name is. He only finds out after she dies. Her identity again is revealed. So again, we have this issue of the fullness of who she is only after she dies. She writes in the desert, please bury Mary. Poor Zosimus is an old man. He can't manage, so he gets someone's help. Do you remember who helps him?
The lion.
The lion, yeah. What do we have here again? An animal acting tamely in the presence of a holy person. Back to that theme that we saw yesterday. So many beautiful, no wonder this was such a popular story. It's almost moving me to tears as I'm retelling it. It's so moving, and it's so challenging and comforting at the same time. It is beautiful, it's entertaining, but from a theological point of view, it's profoundly challenging. There's no wonder that she becomes such an icon, especially in the time of Lent. And it exists in almost all the languages of the ancient world. It was widely told and retold. Here's some, it's hard to...
Is in April.
I think so, yeah.
April 1st.
Yeah.
Zosimus is also on our calendar, but our current calendar from Buquerque, they removed Febronia.
Oh. For?
June the 25th.
Oh, okay, June the 25th, okay.
They substituted the parents of John the Baptist, which they probably both were commemorated originally.
Right.
Which, God forbid we have more than one saint. I think it's Febronia.
This was the only, there may be more, there aren't a lot of images of Mary of Egypt in the Western Christian tradition, but there's one that I found. That's from France. Penitent harlot types of saints. Of course, we all know our dear friend Mary Magdalene was not a prostitute. That was not in the Bible. That was later tradition. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that she was a prostitute. All we know is that demons came out of her. But anyway, those types of penitent female prostitute types of saints usually are presented with their hair down in iconography, so you can see her there. But it's interesting how different the West and the East depict her, isn't it? We could have a whole conversation about that if we wanted to. Why? The symbols are different. They mean different things. They point to different things. I believe actually that's an Armenian icon. And it has the whole narrative of her story in surrounding her. Okay, so there's also then a lot of traditions about making pilgrimages to places, we talked about this yesterday, associated with the saints, and getting the dust of a place where a saint may have been, the sacred dust mixed with oil. This is something which we all still understand. We still like to get our trinkets, right, when we go to holy places. Right, of course, we want something. One of the most popular figures to be depicted, this is a little vial for oil here. There's a lot of these that archaeologists have found around saint shrines. And a very popular woman who we'll talk about now briefly was Saint Thecla. We're going to talk a little bit about Saint Thecla, another great female story. She comes from Antioch on the Orontes, Antakya today. This is a picture of what it looks like today. Very different image from, much of Antioch was destroyed from earthquakes. So the city sits on a fault line, and a lot of the ancient parts of Antioch from the ancient world are gone. But if you were ever to go there, it was of course a very important center for early Christianity. It was in Antioch where people were first called Christians, according to the Acts of the Apostles. And you can see some vestiges of how beautiful the culture was there. There's different mosaics. Actually, at Dunbar and Oaks here in Washington, D.C., I think they also have some, if you ever have a chance to go look at their collection. So St. Thecla is a story about a woman who is a disciple and an apostle. She's venerated really as one of the apostles. a proto-martyr and apostle. She is, the story of the Acts of Paul and Thecla was very popular in the early Christian period. I'm actually going to jump to the next slide and then come back, because it centers around the apostle Paul. Paul is often depicted, almost always, with a balding head and a beard. That's the sign. Those are his typical features. And the notion that he was bald, that he had those features, actually comes from the Acts of Paul and Thecla. It's actually in that text where he's described as looking that way. It goes to a great length to say that he was not an attractive man. They says, he was balding and, and stubby-legged and bull-legged and kind of stout. And so I think the reason they do that is to show that Thecla, because Paul comes to her city, and Thecla is a highborn woman betrothed to be married, comes from a very high background. She hears Paul's words about Christianity, and she's completely all in, completely moved, completely captivated, like falling in love. And that's what's so beautiful about the Acts of Paul and Thecla. It sounds like a romance it sounds like she's kind of falling in love with Paul. That's not what's going on. The story is playing with that motif, though, and turning it on its head. She's falling in love with Jesus. She's falling in love with Jesus. She's falling in love with the gospel. And that's what's changing her heart. And so you see, so she casts off her former self. She wants to join Paul. She wants to live the life of an apostle herself. He presents in his preaching a whole homily that is praising the ascetic life. But this for women is going to be something different, right? Because for them, marriage in the ancient world had different connotations. I don't want to go off too far in this direction, but suffice to say, a young girl would pass from the control of her father into the household of her husband. That was it. You moved from under, sort of one patriarchal care to another. And once you got married, there was a great chance that your life could be very difficult. Childbirth had a very high mortality rate. Lots of kids, even if you survived having a child, your kids might not. Many kids died in the ancient world. There was a very, very high rate of children that didn't even make it to age 2. And that's important when we read these stories. When you see the texts, especially about female saints glorifying the ascetic life, for them that represented freedom, an opportunity to sort of get out of the difficulties of what marriage could bring and have a freedom. So virginity and consecrating your virginity is presented as freedom in the stories of the female saints, very much so. What does she do? She completely changes herself in dramatic ways to become an apostle just like Paul. She cuts her hair, dramatic symbol. Cutting off her beautiful hair, but also, why? Well, then she can dress up like a man and be an apostle, because you can imagine it wouldn't have been safe for a woman to go out on the road by herself. She had to sort of take on the identity of a man or look like a man. She rejects her family and lives. So there's this motif in the stories of Thecla that the apostle is always a stranger. You don't really belong to this world. You don't really feel comfortable in this world because you belong to another world. So you move from place to place very quickly without getting too attached. And this is what's kind of moves the narrative along. That she does all these wonderful things. She preaches. She baptizes herself. It's right in the middle of the story. She can't find anyone to baptize her. She baptizes herself. And then she goes through, there's a lot of scenes of animals and different sort of opportunities to kill her, one after another. They're sort of unsuccessful attempts at martyrdom. And I remember my teacher, Susan Harvey, when she taught this story, she said she's kind of like a superwoman of the early Christian world. I kind of like that image. She's sort of this superwoman. And this is an image of Saint Thecla. She's often shown with the lion. There's a very famous scene in her life where she jumps into a pool of ravenous seals who don't eat her. They actually turn over and die rather than eat her. So there's a lot of fun motifs of with the animals in the lives of Thecla. She is saved from being burned. The lioness who was supposed to eat her turns into her kitty cat, licks her feet, you know. So again, it's all of these signs that of what bravery and sanctity looks like when it maps out onto the life of a woman. But notice how it's a very different image of what a typical sort of woman in the ancient world would have been living like. But it was immensely popular. People loved the story of Thecla, especially women. It was very, very popular, so popular that some people got a little bit annoyed about this. Some of the fathers of the church didn't like how popular her story was. This is a picture. Does anyone recognize where this is? Malula, right. And that's where the shrine to Thecla was. Apostle and proto-martyr among women. And I think that it's also venerated by Muslim families. I'm not sure about that, but I think I heard that. I've never been there once, but I think that might be the case, that she's actually also venerated by both religious traditions. But in any case, there has always been a strong devotion to Thecla in the Syriac world and also the Greek-speaking world. Not as much so in the Latin world. The cult and the sort of devotion didn't quite take off in the same way. Just a little bit, not quite so much. Let's see, how are we doing on time? We have a little bit more time, huh? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
I'll tell you one. I have two more stories if you can bear with me.
Go for it.
Two of my favorite women. I'd say that a lot. I have a lot of favorites. How is it possible they can all be your favorite? You know, Mary and Euphemia. Also, you can read the stories of Saints Mary and Euphemia also in the Brock Harvey book. This comes from John of Ephesus, who was a author that lived in the 6th century during the controversies in the church over the Council of Chalcedon. We're definitely not going to talk about that right now. We're going to stick to the saint stories. No, but he, as some of you might know, after the Council of Chalcedon, in the middle of the 5th century, much of the Greek and Syriac-speaking world rejected the Christological articulations of Chalcedon and wanted a single nature Christological articulation. These are the groups associated with St. Severus of Antioch, Philoxenus of Marburg, and from them come the Coptic Church and the Syrian Orthodox Church. But in the 6th century, there was a lot of back and forth about which way the Roman Empire is going to go. Is it going to go with Chalcedon or not? And it isn't until the reign of Justin and Justinian that it seems that Chalcedon is sort of declared once and for all to be the articulation that will be adopted by the empire. So what does that mean? If you found yourself on the wrong side of the fence here, suddenly you don't have imperial support, and that's going to put the church in a very difficult situation. And so John of Ephesus is part of this party. Now he goes back and forth with Justinian and Theodore throughout his life, but after they die, he actually works for them. But after they die, he writes the lives of the Eastern saints to commemorate heroes from where he grew up. John was born in the city of Amida, which is now today Diyarbakir in Turkey, Torabdin area, or close to it. And he writes about women and men whom he knew who modeled sanctity through their bravery and through their holy lives. So Mary and Euphemia is in this collection, and they show two very different types of holiness. They're sisters, but they live very different lives. And this is so beautiful that John puts both of them together. So you have the older sister whose name's Mary. We got a lot of Marys. This Mary, she lives a life of virginity. She lives a life of contemplation. So she's presented as a sort of contemplative spirit, abstinent. She lives a life of prayer. She desires to go on pilgrimage. She takes a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, where she is, according to the narrative, she just likes to gaze upon the place of Golgotha, where our Lord was crucified, and she is even thought to be crazy. So people mistake her for being a mad woman. So they think she's kind of a nutty person. Again, back to that scene, the motif of holy fools. But so she leaves, but as I said, she's a sort of unattached mystic type of contemplative saint. And her sister, Euphemia, is not. She is a very different type of holiness. She was married. We know this because she has a daughter. We don't know anything about her husband. He's not mentioned, so perhaps she was a widow. But in any case, she's a married woman, and with a little girl. And what they do is the two of them work very hard to minister to the people in their city. So they are shown as the sort of active, sort of charity workers. They work for their own, they earn their own keep, and they just keep whatever they need to support themselves. Anything extra they give out to the poor and people who need it. She also goes around her community, knocking on the doors of the wealthy people. John says she assaults them. They get scared when they see her coming. She wins this authority because of her life. People recognize that they have to listen to her. So you need to give. You need to share what you need. Share with people who need it. So she was presented as a great person who helps the poor. And so it's really interesting to see these two types of sanctity together paired in one saint's life. The active, we might say the active and the contemplative. Two sides of the same coin, right? Okay, and then I wanted to end finally with the discussion of the Mother of God. We could spend years talking about this, but I can't sort of speak about female saints without ending with the most important female saint, Jesus' mother, Mary. In the Syriac world, many scholars think that it was in Syriac-speaking Christianity where some of the greatest devotions to Mary may have developed. We have evidence about this. Certainly, already in the Gospels, she's presented as a very important person. The stories about Mary, particularly in the Gospel of Luke. But what she becomes in the later tradition is they take the snippets from the scriptures, and then it gets magnified, and she becomes a very important figure, particularly when it comes to the articulation that that Jesus is God and man, fully God, fully man. His humanity is going to come through his mother, of course. And so at that moment too, she's going to gain even more importance. Who's going to be more important than the Yoldath Aloha, than the mother of God, Theotokos? And one of the things that gets developed very beautifully in Syriac Christianity is what they call the Eve and Mary typology, captured beautifully in this modern icon here. Can you see this? So that's Eve and Mary. I can't tell you how much I love this picture. I mean, this says the entire theology right here. You can see Eve. So by typology, it means one becomes the fulfillment of the other. Eve, our first mother, and see how the snake is wrapped around her leg?
Yeah.
She's downcast, holding that apple. And then Mary, what is Mary doing with the serpent?
Crushing it.
Crushing his head. She's taking Eve's hand to her pregnant belly. It's profound,
The
actually.
one hand caressing the face.
And so this fulfillment that Mary will do everything correct, that Eve kind of got like a little child sort of messed up. I like that image of the fall more like as a little, I'm about to trip over this cord, like tripping. It wasn't that they had this, they didn't know what they were doing, but like little children, they made a mistake and it had this terrible consequence, absolutely. But so Mary's yes, Mary who will use her free will to undo the sin of her mother Eve. Again, the free will, all things, the moment of the incarnation is going to depend on Mary's yes. Syriac tradition also has a robust tradition in the dialogue poems of how Mary will even argue with the angel. It's not just that she says, "Let it be done to me according to thy will." She wants a little bit more. You got to give me a little bit more than that before I say yes. And so there has a lot of the beautiful dialogue poems in Syriac about the arguing that takes place. Mary is a thinker. Mary is a contemplative. She's also a prophet in the Syriac tradition. Everyone talks about that. The spirit of prophecy. She's many things. And Ephraim in his hymns on the Nativity will show how Mary is the first place we look to Mary and to learn so much. First of all, we're going to learn about Jesus. That's his mother. And Mary shows us how to approach Christ, which is always in a spirit of wonder. So as I mentioned yesterday, the hymns on the Nativity talk about the wonder that Mary feels when she's holding her newborn son. How can I give life? So the idea is even nursing her son. Jesus as a baby is in need of the food that only Mary can give him. Mary says, how can I give life to the one who gives life to all? So it's just that mystery, the paradox of the incarnation. And that this isn't necessarily something we can understand. We can only praise it. We can only wonder at it and give thanks the way that Mary does. So it's a beautiful, beautiful cycle of hymns. And also the ear motif is kind of interesting in the Mariology, that, the serpent whispers into Eve's ear, tricks her. And in the same way then, according to many traditions, when Mary says yes, when Mary takes on the role that she will have, the Holy Spirit comes into her through her ear. In the same way that sin enters into the world, redemption comes in through this ear. So this is another really rich tradition, typological tradition, that's captured also by the West, because that's a Western icon. And as I said, I'll close then with one final remark. What's distinct in the Syriac presentations of Mary is that she, especially Ephraim and also Jacob of Syriac, make a lot about the fact that she's the daughter of the poor. She does not come from a highborn family. This is very different from the imperial image of Mary that you'll see like in the Orthodox tradition, Greek Orthodox tradition, where she's seated on a throne like an empress. Instead, Ephraim, for instance, talks about how she is a daughter of the poor. She advocates for all women who are misunderstood and mistreated. Because there is another tradition in Syriac literature about how people treated Mary, not believing what she claimed about the uniqueness of her pregnancy. So all women who have been treated unfairly can look to her. So that's a very rich tradition. The daughter of the poor is the one whom God chooses to carry his son, an unlikely choice by every account. And so for Ephraim, that's something that's another part of the paradox. It's another part of the paradox of salvation. So Mary, so much can be said about her and her power. Also with Joseph. So poor Joseph in the corner looking confused, right? Joseph, there's also a lot of wonderful dialogue poems in Syriac between Mary and Joseph. Joseph is upset at Mary and wants to know why she's how can she be pregnant? Of course, wants to divorce her. That whole question, which is kind of just briefly talked about in Scripture, gets expanded upon in the dialogue poems and in the poetry. It's one of the neat things about hymnography, isn't it? Too, is that it tries to answer questions that we all have. It's a beautiful type of exegesis, and it works them out in the context of the liturgy. Because you can imagine if you're singing these things in church, then that's a way to understand. It has that pedagogical purpose too. Then you learn. It becomes a part of your own understanding. So I'll stop there for now. I hope you enjoyed that. And we can take questions. I welcome your comments. Oh, and I have to say, I told them I want to acknowledge too, since they're not here, the gratitude towards my in-laws who are taking care of my children, speaking of family and also my husband. I wouldn't be there. I couldn't be with you here if it wasn't for their help. So I want to say a thank you and ask you to keep them in your prayers.
Absolutely.
Here we are. So,
Time for questions.
yes.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. We'll give you a minute to rest
We're
and
gonna have
drink
a little
something.
more tea. Yeah, you can start arguing about women.
I have nothing to say. No comment. I'll stay out of that.
That's safe. That's very
Why?
safe.
You never win with women, right?
No comment.
Yeah, don't even comment on that comment.
A big fat buddy, you know.
We declare you a wise person.
No comment.
Don't let the pride get to you like closing us.
Get behind me, Satan.
And don't push me while you're back there.
All right, it's time for questions. Thank you.
Comments or responses? Don't know if I can answer them, but I can try. Yes, please.
I'm not sure if I recall it properly, but Jacob Osuru has an image of Mary born from the side of Jesus at the cross. Can you elaborate?
Is that right?
No, the church.
The church.
And then, of course, she's associated with the church. But
Yeah, she carries a lot of roles. Maybe this is what you're getting at, that sometimes seem contradictory. So she's mother of the church. She's also mother of Jesus and the mother of all believers. But she's also sort of Jesus's bride. There's a sister. So there's a lot of paradoxical things. Jacob does have a wonderful cycle of hymns that describe the visitation. Those are some of my favorites that he has between Mary and Elizabeth. So there again, beautiful image too of Elizabeth, whose pregnancy was also miraculous, and who's also and it makes a big deal about the proper way that Mary responds versus Zechariah, who doubts. There's a lot of really interesting things that he developed. So he's got a wonderful Mariology too. Yes, please.
Is the working assumption that there's an oral tradition behind most, if not all, of these stories? And if so, how long is that oral history? So I guess, what do you think is the typical distance between the time that a saint actually lived and let's say the earliest manuscript that mentions them? We're talking a century, more or less. I don't know if that's something you looked at. But
It really depends. It's a great question. It really depends on the saint. So to take John of Ephesus, his saints' lives were written relatively recently after the times that they describe. But in his collection, we can see something which is, so for instance, John has a story of Jacob Baradaeus, who becomes the great missionary saint after whom the Jacobite church, Syrian Jacobites, and has a story about him. But there's another story about Jacob that circulates 100 years later, based on John's story, which is really different. And so within that story, you can see what tends to happen is the first version is going to be shorter and less dramatic, more historical, for lack of a better word. And then as time goes on, there will accrue more things. Like I like the image of a snowball. It'll start collecting more stuff. That's a very technical term. So to get back to your first, with the traditions about Mary, there's you didn't ask about Mary, but I'll say, for instance, there were a lot of apocryphal stories about Mary in the church, even before that show that people were looking to her. She also carries in some traditions, because, for instance, in the story of Cana, she's presented, the Gospel of John presents her as having this special knowledge and understanding of her son that only Mary knows, that just do what he tells you. She knows something that other people don't know. And that's another sort of aspect of Mary that will get developed in the early church, that she's this kind of bearer of this special knowledge about Christ. So that's another so there's different sort of ways that her person, and then in Ethiopic traditions, they have some really interesting stuff too. We could go on and on, but the hagiographic things, it really just depends on the source. But they're always, Febronia, for instance, is probably written in the 6th century, so that's much later than the 4th century. So we know, for instance, that I believe probably that story did circulate around a particular devotion to this holy woman named Febronia. Now, whether or not she was a martyr, I don't know. Certainly wouldn't there wasn't a community like that in Nisibis in the early 4th century. Just historically, we know that we have no evidence that existed. But you retroject that back onto a particular time to give honor to a woman who probably did exist. Does that make sense? So it's a sort of mixture. It's kind of like untangling a braid, so certain strands are going to be connected and then others were going to be added on. Yeah. Yes, and then Bishop, in the back.
Okay, thank you. My question is about, you said like Saint Febronia was depicted by women's perspective. That was unique, isn't that? Can we perceive like masculinistic traits in the hagiography of women saints in the Syriac tradition, or the opposite, feminist, probably, or not?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's a great question. There's always different ways that the stories of the women and the men get told. It's very typical, with the exception of Thecla, that a woman will live most of her sanctity is sort of closed off, for lack of a better word. She's not usually exposed. So, for instance, you don't have female stylite saints. That's a very perfect example. That's not a practice that's going to develop among women, as far as I know. I don't know of any. Now, if I'm wrong about that, that would be fascinating. But so, for instance, there's a way in which the stories of the men tend to be much more exposed. Or you'll get stories like military saints, soldiers who convert to Christianity. You have that kind of tradition, like Sergius and Bacchus, for instance. Or the doctor saints like George, exactly. The doctor saints like Cosmos and Damien, traveling, out in the road. Whereas in women, with Thecla again being this notable example, that you don't see that. So there's certain things that you just don't tend to see mapped out onto the lives of women. But the martyrs are this interesting example, because a lot of times, and this is true in the Western tradition too, they'll use the sort of most socially, the sort of socially least powerful person in the Roman society to become the greatest hero. Like in the story of Blandina, which was from the persecution of Lyon in the 2nd century, she's a slave. So she's a female slave. And in Roman society, that's about the most disempowered person, that not only are you enslaved, but you're a woman enslaved. You've got nothing as far as society goes. But she becomes a great hero and demonstrates this incredible power through her devotion to Christ and her martyrdom. So you can see how a lot of times the stories will take social expectations of authority and power, and again, take that and invert it and do something very different to show the difference that Christianity is going to make in that person's life. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Bishop. Yes. And then,
Yeah,
please.
you mentioned Febronia. I
Yeah.
was reading somewhere that Febronia might have belonged to the Benai Kiama.
Yes. That's a possibility. We don't know that for sure. It's something that people have wondered about, or if maybe her tradition was connected in some way to that. But it's not quite obvious from the text itself. It's also not impossible. So, daughters of the covenant, yeah. One more question?
Yeah, what was the premise of choosing these particular saints? Because,
Why did I choose them and not others? Or,
well, I mean, one that comes to mind is, Saint Barbara, very.
oh, Barbara's wonderful too.
So I
That's
was wondering what was,
I
how
just
how
chose
does-
some of my favorites. There wasn't a method. Barbara's an interesting example. I mean, she's in a tower. She gets locked up in a tower, which is kind of like a stylite, isn't it? Never think about it. She's high up in a place. But she's killed by her father. Is that right? Isn't that how the story goes? So there's a fascinating, disgusting example of familial violence, in her. That's shocking. It's supposed to shock us, right? But she's really, I haven't studied Saint Barbara in the Syriac tradition, but I know that she's important, She's also, in her iconography, always depicted as a very beautiful woman. So that's very interesting too. Sometimes they're veiled or not. Sometimes their hair is down. There's a lot of people that just study how they are portrayed, these symbols. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm going to give you a break.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.